It was supposed to be just another routine checkup, the kind of appointment parents schedule out of habit, nothing serious, just to make sure everything is normal. The clinic was quiet that morning, with the smell of disinfectant in the air, and soft murmurs of families waiting their turn. A father walked in with his 5 daughters, their colorful hoodies and sneakers bringing a bit of life into the sterile blue waiting room. They all looked healthy and cheerful, like any other group of siblings waiting for their names to be called. But there was something about the dad that immediately caught the nurse's eye. Something just felt off. He kept glancing at the door, as if he expected someone to follow them in. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. His leg bounced non-stop, and when the nurse called out their name, he hesitated for a second too long before standing up. It was subtle, the kind of thing most people would miss, but not a trained nurse who had seen countless families pass through these halls. She made a mental note of it, brushing it off for the moment as nerves. After all, some parents do get anxious during doctor visits, especially when they have multiple kids. The checkup started like any other. Each daughter stepped up one by one, giggling during the height measurements, curious about the stethoscope, and answering questions with the innocence and honesty only kids can manage. The father stayed quiet for most of it, occasionally chiming in with a detail or two. Still, the nurse couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her too closely, like he was trying to gauge her reaction to everything, like he was afraid of something being discovered. When it came time for routine blood samples, the dad's demeanor shifted completely. He started asking odd questions, whether the tests were really necessary, how long the results would take, if the blood would be tested for anything else beyond the usual. His voice was calm, but his eyes darted around the room. That's when the nurse's curiosity turned into concern. She kept her expression neutral and answered his questions professionally. But her instincts told her there was more going on than a simple checkup. The girls were brave. Even the youngest didn't cry during the blood draw. The nurse labeled the vials, her mind now racing with thoughts she couldn't ignore. She had seen concerned parents. This wasn't concerned, this was fear. And it wasn't for the kids' health. It was something deeper, something hidden. She walked out of the exam room and took the samples straight to the lab. As the machine began running tests, she stood there, arms crossed, watching the screen, waiting. The room was quiet except for the hum of equipment and the occasional beep. Then, as the first round of results came through, her breath caught in her throat. She blinked and stared at the screen again, just to be sure. Then she checked the labels. All the names matched. But what she was seeing didn't make sense. Not for sisters, not for biological siblings. One result could be explained away. A genetic quirk, maybe, but 5. 5 different profiles that should have been closer, more connected. Her heart started racing. She wasn't a detective, but something about this wasn't right. And suddenly, the father's nervousness made perfect sense. She returned to the exam room, trying to stay composed. The father was still seated, phone in hand, but not really looking at it. He looked up when she came in, and the moment their eyes met, he knew. She knew too. There was a silence so heavy it filled the room. The daughters, unaware of the tension, were talking softly among themselves. Swinging their legs from the examination table, the nurse excused herself quickly and made a call. She didn't accuse him, didn't raise her voice or make a scene, but she knew she had stumbled onto something much bigger than a medical visit. Something no one was prepared for. Why would a man bring in 5 girls, calling them all his daughters, when the test results said something very different? Who were these girls? And more importantly, did they know the truth? What started as a simple checkup had now turned into a mystery with more questions than answers. Was this a case of mistaken identity? A blended family with secrets? Or was something darker hiding behind that father's forced smile? As the nurse waited for the doctor and the hospital staff to step in, She kept watching the man. He wasn't making a run for it. He wasn't angry or shouting. He just looked tired. Tired like someone who had been carrying a secret for far too long. Tired like someone who knew this day would eventually come. Whatever the truth was, it was about to unravel. And in that moment, in that tiny, quiet exam room, a nurse realized she wasn't just part of a routine appointment anymore. She was standing at the edge of a story that could change the lives of 5 innocent girls forever. What happens next might shock you. The truth behind those blood samples will raise questions no one in that clinic was ready to face. Stay tuned. The nurse walked briskly down the hallway, the folder with printed test results held tightly in her hands. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. She'd seen unusual test results before: mistakes, odd mutations, even cases of rare diseases. But this wasn't like that. This pointed to something more personal, something that didn't add up within the boundaries of normal family biology. She glanced again at the papers. Each of the 5 girls showed no major health issues, but the genetic markers told a different story. These girls weren't biologically related, at least not all of them. And most notably, none of them shared genetic traits with the man who brought them in, claiming to be their father. She reached the attending physician's office and knocked softly. Dr. Chen, a calm and seasoned pediatrician, looked up as she entered. She handed him the papers without saying a word at first. He scanned the documents, eyebrows knitting slowly. Then he leaned back in his chair, resting his hand over his mouth for a moment. The silence between them said everything. Back in the exam room, the father sat with a fixed expression, like he was holding something inside that he didn't dare let out. The girls were chatting among themselves, unaware of the quiet storm gathering. Outside that door, the oldest, probably around 11, glanced up a few times, sensing something was different. She watched her father carefully, her small hands resting in her lap, fingers fidgeting. She wasn't saying anything, but she was clearly paying attention. The doctor finally returned, composed and professional, greeting the family with his usual warmth. The nurse followed, standing quietly behind him. They spoke with the father gently, suggesting that the lab had encountered some inconsistencies and that it might be best to rerun some of the blood work. Just a precaution, they said. Ash. Nothing alarming, yet just a few irregular markers. But even with the soft approach, the father's reaction gave away more than he meant to. His hand tightened around his phone. He nodded too quickly. Eyes darting once again between the nurse and the doctor, the girls were taken into another room for a routine physical assessment, giving the staff a chance to speak to the man alone. That's when things began to shift. The nurse stepped out of the room shortly after and found herself leaning against the wall outside, heart still unsettled. She couldn't hear everything they were saying, but the tone was changing. The father wasn't defensive, he was guarded. He wasn't denying anything, but he wasn't offering anything either. It was like watching a man walk a tightrope, knowing the fall was coming, just unsure when she started to think back to earlier moments, how the girls interacted. They were close, no doubt about it. They joked like sisters, teased each other, helped the younger ones with zippers and untied shoelaces. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation between them. Whatever the blood said, they believed they were family. But why bring them to a public clinic if there was something to hide? Why submit them all to testing that could expose secrets? Unless he didn't think it would be discovered. Maybe he assumed no one would look closely, that a routine checkup was just that routine. He underestimated the power of curiosity and instinct. And now the quiet had turned into questions in the next room. One of the younger girls asked the nurse how long it would take before they could go home. She smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from the little girl's face, and said it wouldn't be long. But even as she said it, she wasn't sure anymore. Not because of the tests, but because of the weight hanging over this family. The nurse returned to the staff room and checked the system again. She wasn't supposed to dig deeper without consent, but the basics were their names, birth dates, registered guardian. Everything on paper looked fine, but then she noticed something odd. 2 of the girls had the same last name. The other 3, different surnames. That might not mean anything. Blended families are common. Still, with the genetic results, it added another layer. She tried to recall what the man had said earlier. "They're all mine," he'd claimed, his voice too confident. But if that were true, where were the maternal details? No paperwork mentioned the mother. No emergency contacts beyond him. No schools or medical history filled out properly. Everything was sparse, like it had been thrown together last minute. Or like someone didn't want too many details written down. Dr. Chen stepped in quietly. He placed a hand on her shoulder and spoke in a low voice. "He says they're all adopted," he told her. "That he's been raising them as his own. Adopted." The word landed heavily. That could explain the differences in blood. It might answer the biological questions, but not the emotional ones. Why hadn't he mentioned it earlier? Why not be open about it from the start, especially if everything was legal and above board? Unless it wasn't. The nurse looked down. The hall where the girls were now sitting quietly, legs swinging off the examination table, talking softly among themselves again. They still didn't know anything was wrong. Their world hadn't shifted yet, but it might soon. And she wondered, what would happen if the truth came out here? If this man wasn't who he said he was? If those girls didn't belong to him at all? There was no sign of panic in his voice when he spoke to Dr. Chen. But there was no emotion either. He spoke like someone who'd rehearsed this moment, who knew this conversation might happen someday, and had a story ready just in case. Maybe he believed he was doing the right thing. Maybe he truly thought of himself as their protector. But facts were facts. And facts don't bend to good intentions. The clinic staff began quietly discussing their next steps. The proper authorities would need to be involved if there was even a hint of suspicion. No accusations yet, no confrontation, just caution. For the girl's sake, for everyone's. Meanwhile, the nurse sat down in the break room, her thoughts tangled. She couldn't stop thinking about how tightly the youngest clung to his hand when they walked in, or how the eldest gently reminded the others to say thank you after their checkup. There was real love in that group, but love doesn't erase questions. And questions were now multiplying with every hour. The truth was no longer hidden in the lab results alone. It was buried in years of secrets, in fragments of a story that hadn't been told yet. A story that someone in that room knew, but wasn't ready to share. And as the clinic door swung open again for the next patient, the nurse couldn't help but glance back toward the hallway. Whatever had begun that morning was far from over, and what they would all discover next could change everything. The nurse couldn't shake the feeling that something about this whole situation was carefully constructed, like a puzzle designed to look complete until you really studied the pieces. She walked past the room again, just to check in. The girls were now quietly drawing on sheets of paper with crayons a staff member had brought in to keep them busy. Their laughter echoed softly down the hallway, warm and real. It was the kind of sound you hear from children who feel safe. Whatever questions the adults had, the kids didn't seem to sense the storm building around them. Inside the office, the man sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap, his knuckles white. He stared ahead, barely blinking. He didn't ask to see the test results. He didn't even ask for an explanation. He just sat there, as if he was waiting for something or someone. Dr. Chen tried to keep the conversation steady, probing gently around the edges. He asked about the adoption process, about paperwork, about how long he had been taking care of the girls. The man answered every question, but each response came like it was pulled from memory rather than emotion. There were no stories, no personal touches. Just facts, plain, rehearsed, and cold. And then he slipped when Dr. Chen asked about the youngest girl's allergies, something that had shown up on her chart. The man answered confidently. But what he said didn't match the report. It was a small thing, a detail many might miss. But doctors don't, especially when they're already on alert. That one inconsistency opened the door to more. It became clear that while he knew things about the girls, he didn't know everything. Not the kind of details a full-time parent would. Back in the nurses' station, two of the staff were whispering. One had quietly contacted social services just in case. It wasn't a report yet, just a heads-up. A request to look into any open cases involving missing children or custody issues. No one wanted to believe the worst, but the responsibility to protect those girls weighed heavily now. Too much just didn't add up. In the next room, the eldest daughter looked up from her drawing. She asked one of the nurses if her dad was okay. The nurse smiled, telling her he was just talking to the doctor, but the girl didn't seem convinced. There was a look in her eyes that said she'd seen more than people realized. Maybe she didn't know the full truth, but she knew something wasn't right. She bit her lip and looked at her sisters, all still playing. Then she went quiet. The nurse returned to the lab again. She reviewed the samples, rechecked the results, confirmed the labels. There was no mistake. These girls were not sisters by blood, and none of them were biologically linked to the man who brought them in. It wasn't a rare mutation or a fluke. It was clear. Each sample told its own story, different origins, different traits, different families, and yet they acted like sisters. They looked out for each other. The middle child helped the youngest tie her shoes. The second eldest wiped paint from her little sister's cheek while they drew. These weren't strangers forced together. They shared something real, if not in blood, then in bond. Later that afternoon, while the staff waited for a callback from social services, one of the nurses checked online databases with just the children's first names and rough birth dates. From their forms, she cross-referenced missing persons records. There were no exact matches, but one name stood out. Kay, a girl who looked almost identical to one of the five, reported missing nearly 3 years ago from a neighboring state. The resemblance was close enough to raise concern. The authorities would have to make that call. But it was another piece in a growing puzzle. As the day wore on, tension built behind the scenes. The father remained eerily calm. When offered coffee or food, he declined. When asked if he wanted to call someone, he said no. He didn't even ask to check on the girls again. It was as if he already knew his time with them was running out. In the break room, the nurse sat down with Dr. Chen. If he really adopted them, why keep it is secret? She asked quietly. Why act like he's hiding something? Dr. Chen sighed. Because maybe he's not hiding the adoption, he said. Maybe he's hiding where he found them. That thought lingered. There were many angles no one had considered yet. Was he a distant relative who stepped in when no one else did? Did he take the girls to protect them from something worse? Or was it the opposite? Had he built a story around them, pretending to be their guardian to serve a need only he understood? A subplot began forming in the minds of the staff. Maybe the man had created a family out of tragedy. One girl from foster care, another from a struggling home, a third who slipped through the cracks. Piece by piece, he assembled something that looked like love. Maybe to him it was. Maybe it was his way of fixing something broken in his own past. But love, no matter how deep, couldn't erase legal questions or biological truths. And if these girls were missing from somewhere else, someone out there was still looking for them, then time was running short as the sun began to dip. Casting long shadows across the clinic floor, The call finally came in from Child Services. They would be sending someone over. Quietly, discreetly. No uniforms, no drama. Just someone trained to ask the right questions and observe closely. The nurse peeked into the room once more. The girls were finishing their drawings. The youngest had drawn what looked like a house, with all 5 of them and the man in the center. A big smile on each face, a heart drawn above them all. It was innocent, pure, and it hurt to look at, because the adults in the hallway weren't sure if what she drew was her life or just her hope. No. One wanted to break their world apart, but sometimes truth comes whether you ask for it or not. And somewhere inside the quiet clinic, the truth was beginning to find its voice. The air inside the clinic had shifted. Everything looked the same on the surface. The posters on the wall, the gentle hum of machines in the background, but everyone on staff could feel it. The nurse found herself checking the hallway again and again, her ears tuned for any unusual sound, her eyes flicking toward the front door every time it opened. The children were still in the exam room, laughing softly, now seated on the floor with coloring books and juice boxes. But the man, he hadn't moved from the chair outside Dr. Chun's office. His hands were still folded. His expression hadn't changed, but it was too calm now, too still. Like someone holding their breath, Child Services would be there any minute. A caseworker named Helen was on her way. She'd asked that nothing be said to the man just yet. She wanted to observe first, talk to him directly, and then meet the girls separately if necessary. It was protocol, but it also made sense. The last thing anyone wanted was panic or resistance. The nurse hoped that if the truth had to come out, it would come gently, but the truth has its own timing. Helen arrived quietly, dressed in plain clothes, her badge tucked in her purse. She introduced herself softly and quickly scanned the scene. The nurse briefed her with low, cautious words. The 5 girls, their blood tests, the mismatched surnames, the man's conflicting answers, and that one potential match in the missing child registry. Helen listened, nodded, and asked to see the man first. She approached him with warmth, introducing herself as a hospital liaison doing routine follow-ups. He didn't flinch, didn't ask questions. He just looked at her and gave a tight smile, nodding. She asked if they could speak in private, and he followed her to one of the consultation rooms without a word. Inside, the nurse and Dr. Chen stood outside the door, not listening, just waiting. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Helen didn't come out. Neither did he, but the tension began to thicken like fog. The nurse paced the hallway, stopping to check on the girls, who were now getting a little restless, asking when they could go home. The oldest girl had stopped drawing. She just sat there quietly, arms crossed, eyes locked on the hallway door. She could feel it too inside the consultation room. The caseworker began to press gently. She asked about each girl, how long he'd had them, where he'd met them, what their favorite foods were, their bedtime routines. And at first, his answers came like clockwork. Polished, clean, but not deep. Then Helen began shifting the questions, asking about their childhood illnesses, about who took them to school, about moments no parent would forget, and the cracks began to show. His sentences stumbled, his tone tightened. He started repeating himself. He looked at her with eyes that were no longer calm but cornered. She gently placed a folder on the table and slid it toward him. Inside was the printout of the missing child notice. One of the girls' photos was nearly identical too. The face of the child in that document, just a little older now. The hair slightly longer. The face more grown, but unmistakable. And that's when everything started to change. His hands began to tremble, just slightly. He leaned back in the chair, running a hand down his face. And for the first time, his words broke the practiced calm. "I didn't steal them," he said softly. "I saved them. Helen paused, letting the silence fill the space. She didn't react, didn't press. She let the weight of that statement sit between them. Then she asked him to explain, but he didn't continue. He just stared at the wall, jaw clenched, as though speaking the rest of it might shatter something he wasn't ready to face. Back in the hallway, the nurse watched as 2 more staff members stepped in. The tension now felt like static in the air. The youngest girl had started to cry, asking for her father. The oldest stood and came to the door, asking what was going on. She didn't scream or demand answers. She just looked with wide, questioning eyes, the kind of eyes that made you want to protect her. Helen finally stepped out of the consultation room, her face calm but firm. She asked the nurse to bring the children into a separate room, one with a few chairs and a table. She wanted to speak to them privately, one at a time. The nurse hesitated, glancing at Dr. Chen, who gave a slow nod. When the children were brought in, the father stood up, but Helen held up a hand and gently told him to wait. For the first time, something changed in his expression. Fear. Not panic. Not anger, just pure fear. He tried to smile at the girls, but it was weak, and the oldest one didn't smile back. Helen spoke to each child slowly and carefully. She didn't lead them. She asked open questions about their home, their past, where they lived before they were with him. And that's when the final crack opened. Each story was different. One said she remembered another house, a woman who used to sing to her at night. Another said she had an auntie who wasn't her real aunt but used to take care of her. Third girl said she wasn't supposed to talk about where they lived before because Daddy said it would make people mad. The nurse sat outside the room, listening now, her stomach in knots. She realized then that this man hadn't just taken these girls somewhere and told them to call him Dad. He had built an entire story for them, one strong enough that they believed it, even if parts of it didn't make sense. One strong enough that, for a while, no one questioned it. But now, every piece was coming loose. The father, if that's what he truly believed, he was sat in a quiet corner of the clinic, waiting. He knew. Everyone knew. This was no longer about a checkup or test results. It was about truth. It was about who these girls really were, where they came from, who might still be looking for them, and why he had gone through so much to create a new life out of so many secrets. The climax was near. Everyone in the clinic could feel it. And behind one closed door, a man waited for a knock that could change everything. Just when it felt like the truth was finally surfacing, a second twist shattered the fragile understanding everyone thought they were beginning to grasp. As Helen stepped back into the consultation room to prepare her final report and contact the proper authorities, the clinic's front desk buzzed with activity. A woman had arrived out of breath, eyes wide with panic. She clutched a faded folder in one hand and a worn-out phone in the other. She didn't wait to be greeted. She pushed past the front desk and demanded to see the children. At first, the nurse thought it was just another worried parent in the wrong place. But something about the woman's urgency, her trembling voice, the way she said the girls' full names, made everyone pause. The receptionist glanced toward the hallway where the children were still with Helen, and then back at the woman. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "One of those girls is my daughter. She was taken from me 4 years ago." The room fell silent. The nurse stepped forward carefully, her voice calm, trying to ask the right questions without setting off a panic. But the woman wouldn't sit. She wouldn't wait. She pulled out a photo and old-school picture, slightly bent at the corners, and there she was. The same girl who had drawn the house and the heart earlier that day. Same eyes, same soft smile. Security was called not to remove her, but to keep the space controlled. Dr. Chen joined the front office as the nurse quickly stepped down the hall to alert Helen, The caseworker came out with the child in question and froze when she saw the woman. The girl, Sophia, hesitated at first. She looked at the woman for a long moment, unsure. But then, something in her expression changed. Confusion gave way to something softer, familiar. She didn't say a word, just tilted her head slightly, as if a forgotten melody was returning in fragments. But before anyone could process the moment fully, a man still seated, still waiting, stood up and stepped forward. His voice was hoarse, but it cut through. The silence, she gave her up. She didn't want her. I found her in a shelter. I gave her a life. Everyone turned to him. The woman shook her head immediately, tears streaming down her face. "That's not true," she said. "She went missing from our backyard. I never stopped looking for her. I've reported it every year. I've never moved, hoping someone would come knocking. I never gave her up." Helen's eyes were now moving between them both, piecing together a more tangled story than anyone expected. The initial assumption had been difficult enough, a man who wasn't related to the children posing as their father. But now, with a possible birth mother standing in front of them, claiming one of the girls had been abducted years ago, the stakes had just been pushed to another level. The nurse slowly walked Sophia back toward the room with the other girls, heart pounding. The child looked up at her and whispered, "She smells like someone I knew." In the consultation room, Helen placed a quiet call to law enforcement. This was no longer a medical case. It had now crossed into something that would require deeper investigation, paperwork, identification, and likely DNA confirmation. And still, no one truly knew how deep it all went. As officers were dispatched to the clinic, the man didn't run. He didn't argue. He just stood there, as though he'd expected this part too. But then came another twist, as one of the staff reviewed the list of names and birth dates, again now triple-checking everything against databases. They noticed something strange. Two of the names didn't just match similar missing child reports. They matched children from different states, listed missing around the same time frame. Two girls, two different last names. Two different disappearance stories. Both had been taken from public parks under seemingly random circumstances. And now both were sitting in that exam room, laughing softly with each other, thinking they were sisters. A chill ran through the entire clinic. This wasn't just one child found. It might be three, possibly more. The father figure, that's what he was, looked around the clinic slowly, as if taking it all in for the last time. His hands were in his pockets. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't shouting. He simply whispered, "I kept them safe. I never hurt them. I gave them a family." Helen walked up to him, standing directly in front of him now. "But they had families," she said, her voice tight. "You just weren't one of them." The man didn't argue. He just nodded slowly as the officers arrived at the clinic and began to quietly assess the situation. The man was calmly escorted to the back for questioning. No cuffs, no resistance, just silence. The nurse turned back toward the girls, still trying to smile, still trying to keep them from sensing the chaos unraveling around them. One of them looked up and asked, "Is Daddy in trouble?" She hesitated for a moment, then gently said, "We're just trying to make sure everything's okay." But she knew nothing would ever be the same again. And now, with multiple families, possibly connected to the girls, a man with no legal custody claiming he rescued them, and the first mother stepping forward claiming one of the missing daughters. The storm was only beginning, and no one, neither staff nor police nor the caseworker, was ready for what would be uncovered next. The exam room, once filled with soft laughter and the innocent chatter of children, had grown still. The five girls, sensing the shift around them, now sat quietly, each one clinging to the drawings they'd made earlier, as if holding on to something familiar would help steady the ground beneath them. Helen returned to them slowly, a gentle expression on her face, but her eyes betrayed the storm she carried. She asked the girls to sit in a circle and told them that some people were going to help answer big questions about who they are, where they came from, and who might be looking for them. None of the girls cried, not yet. They just listened, unsure of what all of it meant, in the hallway. Police officers quietly reviewed the files with Helen, the nurse, and Dr. Chen. It had been confirmed 3 of the 5 girls matched active. Missing child reports. 1 had been missing for nearly 4 years, 1 for 2, and another just under a year. The others didn't yet match any open reports, but the search had widened and results were still coming in. Each story was different. 1 child had gone missing from a mall, another from a playground, another during a custody exchange that went wrong. Yet all 5 had been brought together under the same roof. Raised by a man who was not their legal guardian, not their parent, and according to the blood work, not even a distant relative. The man sat in a holding room now. Not restrained, but watched closely. An officer had offered him water. He hadn't touched it. His face was unreadable. He hadn't confessed to anything outright, but he'd said something strange when they asked where the girls came from. They were lost, he whispered. I just found them. But when pressed on how he found them, where, under what circumstances, he fell quiet again. Not angry, just still. It was in the middle of this confusion. Just as social services began preparing to transport the girls for temporary protection placement, that the final unexpected twist emerged. Helen received a call urgent, direct, and from someone high up in federal investigations. It wasn't just that some of the girls had been found in missing persons databases. One of them wasn't missing at all. She had been reported dead. The child Maria, the smallest of the group, had supposedly died in a car accident along with her mother 2 years ago. The case had been closed. A funeral had been held. The paperwork was complete, but the blood test and facial recognition check triggered a flag that reopened a sealed file. Someone had made a mistake or covered up something deeper. Helen's face went pale as she listened to the full report. According to new evidence, the child in the crash had never been identified by DNA. The accident had been severe. A fire had destroyed records. The mother had been assumed to have had her daughter in the car because her belongings were found in the wreck. But now, with Maria sitting quietly in a clinic coloring unicorns, that story no longer made sense. She walked over to the girl and knelt down beside her, carefully asking a few gentle questions. "Do you remember your mommy?" she asked softly. Maria nodded. "She used to sing to me at night." Helen asked her where she went after her mommy stopped singing. The girl thought for a moment, then said, "He picked me up. He said, 'Mommy was in the sky and I would be safe with him.'" That sentence, so innocent, so heartbreakingly clear, hit like a wave. The man hadn't just taken children. He had found some of them in broken places. Maybe he didn't plan it. Maybe it wasn't organized, but it was deliberate. Somewhere between a rescuer and a thief. He had gathered these girls and built a false world, one made of bedtime stories, new names, and carefully layered lies. And now it was falling apart. Law enforcement began making official calls to the families of the matched children. 3 confirmed. 1 potentially declared dead, now alive. And the 5th still unknown, but likely not his either. In the holding room, an officer told the man about Maria, about how she was supposed to be gone. The man finally reacted. He leaned forward and whispered, "She was at the side of the seed road, crying. I waited 3 hours for someone to come. No one did." The officer asked why he didn't call the police. "They'd take her away," he said. "I wanted her to be loved." It was hard to know what to call what he did. He wasn't violent. He didn't seem evil. But he had taken lives that weren't his to take, shaped identities that weren't his to shape. and told 5 little girls a story that now would take years to unravel. Later that evening, as the girls were gently moved into temporary care and matched with trauma counselors, Helen stayed behind with the nurse. They sat in silence for a long moment, both staring down the hallway that had felt so normal just hours earlier. He really thought he was protecting them, the nurse finally said. Helen nodded. Maybe, but love without truth becomes something else. And just as they stood to leave, the nurse noticed a piece of paper left behind on the floor of the exam room. It was one of the girls' drawings. A house, 5 girls. One man in the center, all smiling. But this time, in the corner, a small figure had been added. A woman standing just outside the house, watching, waiting. Maybe the girls always knew something was missing. Maybe they always knew the story wasn't finished. The days that followed were heavy with emotion. The clinic had returned to its usual rhythm checkups, flu shots, stethoscopes hanging by their cords, but something had changed. Everyone who had been there that day carried the weight of what had happened. The nurse, who had first sensed something off in the father's nervous glances, now found herself looking at every family just a little differently. Not with suspicion, but with care. With curiosity about the unseen stories people walk in with. The 5 girls were placed in protective custody, each one assigned a specialized trauma team and child advocate. Maria, the girl once thought to be dead, had become a national story within days. News outlets quietly ran the story with caution, protecting the children's identities. But the headlines were enough to stir the country. Child presumed dead, found alive in routine clinic visit. Her maternal grandmother, who hadn't spoken publicly in years, came forward after DNA confirmation and was granted temporary guardianship. She cried through most of the hearing. "I thought I lost everything," she whispered. "But she's still here. She's alive." Sophia, the girl whose mother had walked into the clinic that day, was the first to be fully reunited. It wasn't easy. She didn't remember everything, and the woman who claimed her as her mother had become a stranger. But slowly, with gentle steps and supervised meetings, something began to rebuild. The warmth between them returned not overnight, but with effort. With stories, old songs, and small rituals like bedtime tea and hairbrushing that helped reawaken forgotten memories. The 3rd girl, whose name matched a missing person report from another state, was reunited with an aunt who had never given up searching. Her parents had passed during the early days of the pandemic, and the aunt had filed report after report, each time hitting a dead end. When they were finally brought together again, the girl looked up at her with wide eyes and said, "I think I know you." And the woman broke down in tears. The remaining 2 girls didn't yet have answers. No confirmed biological matches, no waiting family members. But their cases were now at the center of a larger national investigation into lost and missing children. Specialists were working with them, not to erase what they'd lived through, but to help them find peace with it. They had each other, and that bond, whatever its origin, remained strong. As for the man who called himself their father, the legal system handled his case with quiet care. He was charged with multiple counts related to custodial interference and unlawful concealment of minors. But his case raised difficult questions for the courts. There was no evidence of abuse. The girls had been fed, clothed, educated at home, even taken to regular medical checkups. He hadn't hurt them physically. He hadn't trafficked or exploited them. He had created a home one that wasn't his to create. And in the eyes of the law, even misguided love couldn't undo the seriousness of what he'd done. In court, he stood with his hands clasped, just like in the clinic. He spoke only once, softly. "I never meant to lie. I just didn't want them to be alone." The judge didn't respond immediately, just turned the page and moved on. Intent anymore. It was about the right of each child to know their own story. The nurse who had started it all continued working quietly. She never saw credit, never told the full story to anyone outside the clinic. But those who worked with her noticed she'd grown a little quieter, more thoughtful. When someone asked her what made her stop that day, what made her push for the blood tests and follow-up, she simply said, "Something in his eyes." Dr. Chen continued his work too, though his office now kept a quiet file with extra protocols for situations that didn't feel quite right. "Trust your gut," he told the staff. "It doesn't need to be loud, just steady." Helen, the caseworker, was offered a promotion not long after the case wrapped. She accepted, but still made time to check in on the girls' progress. She knew their healing wouldn't be quick, but they were safe. They had their names back, their stories back, their futures back. The clinic never saw another case quite like it again, but the memory lingered. It wasn't just about one man pretending to be a father. It was about how easily truth can be reshaped when no one's looking closely. It was about how the strongest bonds in life aren't always biological, but how truth, identity, and safety still matter deeply. The story of the girls, how they arrived, how they were discovered, how they slowly reclaimed their real names and families became a quiet lesson for those who heard it. A reminder that not all dangers are loud and not all heroes wear badges. Sometimes a story changes because someone notices a nervous glance, asks one more question, or listens just a little longer, and somewhere in a new home. With a warm light in the hallway and a storybook on the nightstand, a little girl named Maria drew a picture again. This time, the house had her grandmother inside, and her name was written clearly at the top, not the name she had been given, by a man with good intentions and deep secrets. Her real name, the one that was always hers, waiting to be spoken again. And in that moment, the story finally closed, not with a loud ending, but with quiet truth finding its way home.